Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. The next talk is about to begin. Art Basel Conversations. This talk is called Activating Public Spaces, and it is related to the project that's going on in the Messeplatz, but I'll let our comrades tell you all about that. I'm very excited to welcome Isabel Lewis, who's an artist, dancer, and electronic music producer based in Berlin. Enrique Fontanilles, who is an artist in Basel, Mulhouse, Casa de la Serra, and a former professor at HEAD in Geneva. And Senam Okudzeto, an artist, writer, and lecturer based in Basel, London, New York, and Accra. And very exciting today to have as our moderator, Elvira Dejani Ose, Senior Curator of Creative Time and lecturer in visual cultures at Goldsmiths University in London. She lives in London, and she curated the Messeplatz project, Basilia. So thank you very much, you guys. I'm really excited. Please join us in welcoming all of them. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. As Mary was saying, we are privileged, particularly Isabel and I, because we have been working for the past 3 weeks in the context of the fair, of course, but also activating and connecting with communities in Basel. So the result of that conversation, or this series of conversations with different agents in the city, is the project that you see downstairs called Basilea, a creative time project commissioned by Art Basel for the fair, which started in May the 23rd, and includes artist Isabel Lewis, artist collective or architectural collective Recetas Urbanas, and Lara Almarsegui. And the project is really an occasion to ask ourselves what is the use that we have of public space. Sorry, I use occasion, which is a term that is coined by Isabel in a very particular context, and perhaps you can start your intervention with that. But I just wanted to say that this is a moment, or what the project is trying to do is to create a sense of awareness of our active role as citizens to interfere in public space, what is the usership of public space, and how we connect with it. As I said to you, we have been here researching for the past 6 months and trying to engage with agents in the city. 2 of those agents were Enrique Fontanilles and Senam Okudzeto. The idea was to not only talk to them, but also to teachers, to students in several educational platforms, but also with representative of public administrations, people in the arts, in the architecture realm, anyone that really want to engage with us in a conversation about what was happening in the city, because Basilea as a project also aims to bring everydayness and publicness that occurs in Basel before and after the fair. And that is also a very important aspect. So today's conversation is about activating public space, and we thought that instead of bringing images of other areas of the world, we will use Isabel project and the activation she's doing in Messeplatz as an introduction to talk about what it means to activate public space. What is publicness? What we are talking about when we talk about public space. So without further ado, I'm gonna lend the floor to Isabel to tell us a little bit about what you're doing for Basilea, but also to expand on your practice and the elements that interest you in the connection with communities and with individuals.
Thank you, Elvira, for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and feel very privileged to be activating the Messeplatz during this time. Maybe to tell you a little bit, as you said, about the format that I call the occasion. This is a format that is about gathering. It's about creating a situation of liveness that extends beyond just visual spectacle and becomes more aesthetic engagement. And I think this is something very important to me, a term that I take from Arnold Berliant. And there's a book on gardens, A Philosophy of Gardens, it's called, by David E. Cooper, where he quotes Berliantes saying that we experience the garden as an occasion, meaning that it's an occasion of experience. It's the coming together of many different impressions that are coming through the body sensorially. So it's already referring to an embodied form of experiencing something. And this quote was something that I took on when I started to work in this format, which for me goes beyond, again, the visual spectacle into creating a situation where all of the senses can be addressed. And that's also, there's also Whitehead's actual occasion as a unit of reality. So in Whiteheadian metaphysics, any unit of reality is called an actual occasion, which means all of the very many minute, microscopic to macroscopic details and conditions of any particular moment. So this is an occasion. And here in Basilea, I expand upon that work, the last several years of working in this kind of format, into, again, thinking about creating an entire day-long program of multiple bodily activations that also activate the space of Messeplatz itself. The program begins at 10, and hourly there are different ways of engaging, and the idea is that all of these moments offer an opportunity to attune the senses to the specificity of urban space, of public space, and specifically this one here in Basel's Messeplatz.
And one of the things that perhaps was most challenging for you, and I want you to talk about this, because I don't know if any of the public had the opportunity to experience what it is. Slow walk, moments of meditation is a challenge towards the time, the eventful time that the fair invites us to, no? And you are making this radical contribution, which is to slowness, to also present somehow the emptiness of the square, right? For those of you that have never visited Basel when the fair is over or before the fair, Messeplatz is a very particular empty architectural void, right? So how does one refer to that, no? Because if we are here also to talk about everydayness, and I also want to talk to you and open to you the floor, Senam and Enrique, as artists that have lived and experienced Basel in all possible chances of opportunities, what does it feel, right? And Isabel, in your project, in general, those occasions that you refer to happen in limited spaces, normally indoors, right? With somehow a certain kind of control. I don't want to call it that way, but there is without, because you obviously work without script in that respect. But there is a much more control environment, let's say, for the sake of a better term. No? So what have been for you to be in that emptiness, to explore that space as it is, to gain, again, quote unquote, control of this, no? And how something that I found extremely provoking, which is to find effectiveness towards the other in that space, but also towards ourselves, to our own bodies. I wonder if you can to refer to that in your practice.
Yeah, sure. I think for me, when you approached me with this idea of creating a public choreography on this particular place, I had to think about, what does the square propose as an architecture or as an architectural void, as a non-space? And it's a very cold, unwelcoming, uninviting, and then alternatively extremely hot because there's no shade, and the asphalt really absorbs all of that heat. And it doesn't really address human scale. It doesn't invite the visitor or the person of the public to linger or to gather. It's a perfect place for surveillance. You have multiple opportunities from high vantage points to observe the square. So it has this feeling of regulation and control to it. I knew that in order to try to create some kind of affect, have some kind of effect on this square, that it would rely on a process of time. So I was very grateful that our project included this opportunity for me to be making regular visits to Basel and to be engaging the public of the public participants in the project, engaging them on the Messeplatz. So slowly, over time, generating relations. So maybe rather than, I don't think of it as that I have a control of the space, but rather I've now lived a relationality with that space, literally with its materials. My body has been in contact literally with all of the materials that make up that space since weeks, along with other participants from the public. So it's the building of relation that I think gives the work its groundedness. What we're still somehow managing to create this space of intimacy and closeness on a very large and public scale.
And can I ask you?
Just having a nap.
Yes.
No, I was totally listening to you.
No, but I think it's also something that was part of our earlier conversation. No, I mean the way that how can we involve the citizen? How can we create a conversation beyond this particular week? No, that the sense of somehow gain appropriation of the space of Messeplatz prior to the fair was critical, not only to your practice but also in terms of the project. No, to live here. I had to say that in order to produce the structure, the multi-purpose civic structure that Resetas Urbanas had built, and in order to run the workshop, Isabel had counted with numbers of participants. We have had, I believe, more than 100 volunteers from different walks of life, living in Basel, traveling past Basel, coming here to work for the fair, that had contributed to that, no? And this sense of the public experience, right? The sense of a possibility to, as you say, engage with the other, to create a relational experience has been very important. But I also want to ask, what is publicness when the fair is over to you guys that live in Basel?
Well, the thing I noticed that I thought as I was leaving, because I've only got glimpses of your performance, but I always sort of get stuck in it for a moment and then I leave. And as I was leaving the other day, you had a Fastnacht clique drumming. And I was like, oh, wild, where did they find them? Because, you know, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, there's two ways I can think of Basel itself activating public spaces regularly. One is Fastnacht every year, the carnival where the whole city is taken over by carnival revelers, by drummers, by cliques, by this huge performance that's a week of revelry. And it's such a bacchanal, it's unbelievable when you think about how ordered Basel is ordinarily. And then the other thing is swimming in the Rhine. Like, you know, every summer we jump into the Rhine, and then that becomes the most activated public space. And, you know, there's a kind of reflection of that. There was a sense of you dipping into that, and it seemed outside of Fastnacht so surreal to have those drummers. And it was also so mad that you only had about 7 or 8 of them, but I could hear the drums everywhere. You know, halfway of my bike ride home, I could hear it. But that was a kind of nice sense of remembering the ways in which the city activates itself regularly and has done for a few hundred years. But also, I suppose why I'm here, Elvira, is you remember the work that I did not so much in Basel, but in Ghana with Art and Social Structures, which was this artist-led NGO project I set up in 2007 to try and bring art and the understanding of art and heritage to ordinary people. And one of the challenges we faced was that ordinary people spend sometimes 3 hours commuting to work in a bus and 3 hours commuting back. They get up at 5 in the morning to go to work, so they don't have time to go to a museum. They don't have time to go anywhere outside of a major public holiday or a festival. Really, they're stuck. So we started doing workshops to train journalists to turn the newspaper into the museum or the newspaper into the art platform. Did 2 major interventions, one on art and one on architectural heritage, so that in a sense, even though we couldn't activate the public space physically, we wanted to activate an understanding of important public spaces in the imagination of people by literally just bringing the space to them because they couldn't go to the space because they were on their way to work for 6 hours of the day. And then another parallel project that we highlighted when we organized this conference together, Elvira with Tate Modern came to Ghana and organized a 1-week conference called Expanding the Walls, and I was privileged enough to, can I say assist you in organizing that?
Of course.
Yeah, thank you.
Curating.
I mean, I didn't want to make myself sound too important. But one of the people we brought in were this amazing group of young artists called the Chalewote Street Arts Festival, who are a group of artists, musicians, rappers, science fiction writers. And they took a traditional African Ghanaian harvest festival called Homowo. Homowo is a harvest festival to celebrate our winter, which is kind of August, when the rainy season comes and the fish come in and the crops are blooming because it's been raining. And they have this festival in the streets in this ancient city, which dates back 400 years. And it's very traditional. They have this stuff called peple, which is like cassava mixed with palm oil, and they sprinkle it on the streets, but they also eat it. The rappers, musicians, graffiti artists, science fiction writers, performance artists joined the festival, right? And just started performing within the festival. It's seamlessly. It's kind of crazy. And they just added this contemporary element to the festival without any conflict with traditional culture. And that's a kind of amazing thing. And it's now in its 7th or 8th year. It's growing more and more popularity. More and more people are hearing about it. And some of the artists who were the founders, like Bernard Okoye Jackson, have gone on to become quite famous internationally. But I think we pretty much put them on the stage, I can say, with that, because nobody heard of them outside of Ghana until that year. But that doesn't really relate to Basel.
No, but there is something very important, which I think also has to do with what we do here, because in a way, Basel is just the possibility of a case study to work around methodologies, urban methodologies, if you want, in which we can test the conversation between tradition, as you have done with the click, and I want to mention Colin Haglander as one of the percussionists, the percussionist that is working with local clicks to make that project possible. But also, as I was saying, using practices as an inquiry, right? Like there is something about the idea of creating, and that's why in our conversations about how can one engage with public space in a different way, we talk a lot about experience, right? And creating experience as an institution, not necessarily just because Chala Water Festival is a festival that repeats, but also because it had created a conversation in Accra about how one can make tradition and contemporaneous prevail in the same.
This idea of tradition and modernity, and actually tradition being something that's performed and invented. And that, in the sense, it's the regular performance that makes a thing tradition. Actually, do you know what? This reminds me of things my Swiss friends say, where they're like, whenever I invite a friend for pizza twice, and he's like, it's a tradition now. If you do something twice in Basel, it's a tradition. It's like, tradition is what you make it.
Well, so then these activations daily are going to start a tradition for our Basel.
Yeah, I hope so.
I mean, I want to somehow take that cue to go to something you hinted a little bit, which is not necessarily to intervene or activate in public space, but what it means to activate public sphere, right? Because creating awareness of our role in society, of our role in public spaces, of our individuality, but also our sense of the communal, is part of like building up a public sphere. And I want to turn to Enrique because, in many respects, as an artist, but also as a professor in several educational platforms, you have also been enriching public sphere, right? And I want us to sort of like to bring your practice, but also your, let's say, your encounter with the forces that run Mesoplast, no? Like to bring some of the anecdotes that have inspired you, no? To sort of try to talk about what it means or have meant for you to intervene or activate public space.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this talk. I was very surprised about that. I have to say some things before I answer your question because I have a very, very particular relation to this square and a very old relation. And for me, this square is, of course, also related to this fair. So, just to say, I was born in 1951 in Barcelona, came here in 1955 to Basel, exported by my parents. And I went to school, to the art school, which is about 200 meters across the square, behind this circus that you can see now. And since then, since 1967, I would cross this square twice a day. And so it happened, I was very young when I started to study. I was not even 16. And the art was for me something, well, not the art fair, art in general was the thing to do. Actually, I had no idea what it was. And when I entered the art school, very fast I decided not to go to the art department, what was my intention first. But I changed to the graphic design department because the whole world would come here for graphic design. There was about 30 American students. There were, in my generation, a lot of French. And in my class was the son of the director of the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. And with him, 68, we went to May 68, which now is the big thing. It's 50 years ago. And 2 years later, not only our class, but a lot of students would stand in front of this building we are in now and protesting. We would protest against the first Art Basel because we would say, what's that shit? Why does art need a fair? So that was actually my first encounter with Art Basel. And then there's lots of other encounters. I won the first prize in video in '94, paid by UBS. So that was already also a big thing, the question that. And then '99, I had a solo show. I left Basel in '98 to go to Geneva to teach. In '99, I was invited for a solo show here with the result that the gallerist got kicked out of the fair. So that was again an event in the other direction. And finally, I think the one, because I am invited now, is that I got arrested 1914. 2014, because we had a memorial of what happened the year before, in 2013, where students, I was then back here, I should say that I was back here as a teacher, to redo the first year of art classes, to redesign it. And Kawamata had this favela built in front of the art. I don't know if you remember that. But my students, of course, they continued to build the favela. They would make more boxes, and they would make music and sell beer for 1 franc instead of champagne for 15. So the police came, kicked them out. It was really hard thing. And the year after, they would ask me, we should do something about that. And we trained the performance to do on the Friday of Art. So we were 25 students and teachers. And we tried to get here. It was impossible. We were 25, the police was 70, and they had heard about that over the internet, and so it was really, what to say, it was a very stupid thing, first of all, but what we had planned has nothing violent, nothing was really something calm. A little bit was a very geometrical performance, remembering the way police acts, but we had whiteboard discs. And so we tried to get here. Some got here, but some got already arrested in school. Some on the way, I got arrested on the square. And we were 25 and 36 people were arrested because everybody who had one of these discs would disappear. So I think it's very interesting to be here today because actually I have not been at the art since. So, but for me it's a very special situation. I mean, I have done things in public space before, always with students, but yeah, I could tell you about that, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, in a way, it does, because I guess that's also the reason why Art Basel saw that it was important to engage in a dialogue with public service organizations that have been dealing with what it is to offer public space to for artists, that even when they have radical proposals to make, challenging questions to ask. No? And I think one of the things that you say, and I want you to talk about it a little bit as well, no, is how that experience for you remind you how important it is to activate the square before and after the fair. Like, what can one do once the fair is over, no? And of course, we're talking about a city which is extremely active in terms of the art. There is art all year, no? But this week is specifically emphasized. And in that respect, also, I want us to go back to the conversations on what is happening in the plaza, no? Like, how we imagine is publicness being relevant, no? You were doing it with the piece. You had talked about perhaps a context in which there have been a particular case of Accra, no, in which perhaps there are less, let's say, formal institutions that are dealing with publicly activating the space, but also the way you talk, Enrique, about the possibilities of activating the square, no, during the year, in between fairs. No? I think that is also a very important question to us. Yeah. Yes?
But look, I want to say something to you, Enrique, because I remember watching the video footage, and it wasn't just the police, it was the riot police that came when everything exploded. What was it, 2014? And what I was going to say was there's a difference between the whole Chalewati thing, which is an informal but traditional exercise, and something as formal and regulated as Art Basel. When you truly have the public coming in, is it a matter of something being, why did the police come so quickly? Because it looked quite benign until the police turned up. It felt like they caused the escalation, but I wasn't there.
Actually, if you're talking about the year we were arrested, I think nobody saw anything. I think if the police would not have intervened then, nobody would have noticed that we would have done this performance. I mean, that's the thing. It's quite difficult to get attention from the public. I mean, probably. And it's just what the police did, what was finally the performance. But I think I remember one of the pieces in public space I like most is from Chris Burden. It's from '72, so it's really old, and it was called Dead Man. He was just lying next to a parked car, but on the driveway, and he was covered by canvas somehow, and I had two lamps. They would last 15 minutes, and he got arrested after 10 minutes with the reason that he was doing something. He was doing a false accident. And I think that's very interesting for now. He was arrested for doing a false thing. And I think art in public space is, you never know what comes out. I mean, this dialogue with the public, and it's not the public you have normally is not the art public. Or not only the art public. So you get a very different structure of people reacting very differently. And I think that's the interesting point about art in public space.
I mean, I think there is something to say about how all these projects intervene the quotidian, no? Like the daily time, the routines. And I want to go back to something you were saying about your activations, no? Because there is a clear time of the event, no? This is what we experience here, no? And how you are proposing aspects to both bring in the audience and the let's say the habitus, the habitual, no? To a time and a moment where perhaps in the case of the time of the fair, the time of the event, that everydayness is lost, no?
Yeah, it strikes me that in some way, I think the reason that I use the term occasion in relation to my work is that I'm not so interested in making work that stands out as a kind of object of discrete observation. I'm much more interested in integration of the senses and the integration of the work into its particular situated landscape, whatever that may be. So it's interesting to hear these moments that seem to kind of thrust themselves into public space and in a way confront the public. But it also strikes me that I'm actually working on a very different strategy on the Platz, on the Messeplatz. It's really, for me, was a more of a process of getting to know this particular urban space in its particular context, not just addressing, not in fact really even, only addressing the fairgoers, but trying to understand what is the city, like how can I get to know the city of Basel and this place in Basel beyond its function as a host of the art fair during this week. So in some ways the interventions that happen every hour, I indicate them at the beginning of every hour with a kind of talk, but otherwise I think they're quite subtle. They're more internal exercises that I propose to the entire public, whether they're the citizens of Basel or the people just visiting, and I aim for a kind of integration into the situation rather than a disruption per se of the activity on the Messeplatz.
But perhaps that has to, and when I go back to Senam, that sense of somehow being part of the fabric, of that subtle, that poetic gesture, that I think your interventions are in places like Accra with this festival, comes through tradition, right? Like how this becoming traditional or institution after the fairs of the second experience turn the project towards affections, right? Which is something that I'm really curious about, no? And I want you, if you can, a little bit reflect on how one can activate affection in public space.
Well, slightly sort of side to that. I mean, there's, the Chalewote Streets Art Festival isn't a complete utopia because some of the lead actors in this project are graffiti artists. And we have this sort of ongoing, Manche and I have this ongoing tension because he loves to graffiti all these old buildings. There are 200, 300-year-old buildings in there. And they believe that by spray painting and graffitiing the buildings, they're giving them life. And a lot of these buildings are ruins or they're falling apart, but many of them, they're always people so poor that they squat in the ruins of these old buildings, even though they're not maintained or recognized by UNESCO. And so the graffiti artists, they feel they're drawing attention to the building. I don't know, I'm too old-fashioned. I kind of like, this is horrible. But they're really excited. And I mean, I love graffiti in New York on a train, but I don't want graffiti on my old architectural heritage in Ghana. Am I a hypocrite?
But how that survive? How you may prevail? The sense of conservation and a certain affection to those buildings.
Well, what's very interesting is that then it highlights the building, and then sort of people older and even more fuddy-duddy than me get angry. They're like, "Oh my God, look at that building! They've ruined it." Meanwhile, they were totally ignoring the building before, and they had no intention of doing anything to fix the building or help the building. So that's kind of interesting. So in a way, the graffiti does work in terms of activating the space. Especially when you have a municipal authority, a city, which never takes responsibility for clearing up graffiti. Because it's not like Europe where there's money for sweeping the roads in these poor areas. There's money. Poor people pay for everything. They pay to have the rubbish from outside their house taken away, and then they pay for it to be taken away from outside their house to the city dump. They paid rates and taxes for every single little thing, and they're still not served properly. So it's kind of interesting that things that would be destructive here actually become activist there and actually do more to kind of highlight an area than you would think. Like, I think if I went to graffiti a building in New York, I wouldn't help to preserve or draw awareness to the community that building would be in. Right? I would be lowering property prices and causing the police to hate me and the bourgeois people to hate me. But in Ghana, these actions have actually had the opposite effect, although it's still, I die when they do it. But it actually does draw attention. So it's a kind of interesting ambivalence. Mm-hmm. Am I helping?
So what happened afterwards?
It's ongoing.
So the graffitis remain there?
It's ongoing. I just went to shoot, a month ago, I went to shoot a film on some of these old buildings that, like a 400-year-old slave castle that was the site of the first Portuguese slave trading post in Accra. It's called the Franklin House, but it was called something else when the Portuguese came. And I took UNESCO there for the first time in 2010. They didn't even know the building existed. And it's squatted by a poor family. The only reason it's even maintained is that they're this poor family living inside. But Chalewote hit the outside. They bombed the outside, right? There's graffiti out there. And, and it sort of drives me crazy. But that means that people have come outside of the people who live there and found this building, because when Chalewote happens, that space is activated. People come from all over to follow their routes. And just on the corner, hidden, which only people from that area know about, is a really famous, the Bookham boxing gym, where some world champions have trained from this like poor area. That's also on the corner. So they've kind of made this sort of amazing route into these alternative modernist, sites of heritage, from like this working class boxing gym that's like, trained these world champions, but that's on a corner to this crazy old slave fort that people need to know about and that needs to be preserved. But again, and it is actually next to a museum that the Brazilian embassy set up, the Tabon House, because there was a slave revolt in Bahia in like 1800, and the response was to deport all the slaves back to Africa. And they were deporting them to Nigeria, but the ship stopped in Ghana on its way to Nigeria, and the local king, the Gamache, was like, hey, you people are cool, why don't you come and live with me? So they got off the ship and they moved to Ghana. But their tribe are called the Tabons, because when they first came to Ghana, when everyone said, how are you? All they could say was Tabon. So they're known as the Tabon tribe, and they still have Portuguese names, but 200 years later, they don't speak Portuguese. And this is in their neighborhood, right? This house, which is not maintained or protected or anything. It's kind of really crazy. And even just next door, there is this museum to the Tabons built by the Brazilian government, but the Brazilian government even haven't put any money into this real heritage site. And you've been there. It's that red brick house. It's crazy. Overlooking the sea. It's like an ancient monument, totally neglected. But again, the graffiti on the outside activates the space again.
Enrique, the space of affection, how to activate public space through affection.
Maybe we could take the example of now, which I think is finally a consequence of what happened until now. And I think it's interesting that Art Basel has chosen your project somehow, because it's, I think, the first time which it tries to deal with people, really. Even if the favela was thought somehow like that, I think it's an interesting idea. It's also a dangerous idea, in the way that you take an activist or activist artists and have them come here to do something. I had a lot of questions. Why is Santi doing that, actually? And
Santi Cirujeda, you mean, the
Santi
architect
Cirujeda, the artist who
urbanism.
built that house and who normally is at the edge of legality. Of course, here there's no edge of legality. Everything is legal and planned. And so I think that would be a big point for discussion. How can such institutions like Art Basel do things like they are doing? And what is there something, a positive result you can take out of that? I think I proposed to Art Basel, after the first talk we had after this event where we were arrested, there were 3 lawyers at the table, just to say it was not just very relaxed talk, but I think it would be interesting to have projects that run from one art to the next, and not only during the art. And as you might know, next year will be 50 years. What will be the 50th edition, let's say? Maybe that would be something to consider, that an institution who has some possibilities, to say it politely, could activate something in the town they are, and that is it possible to activate something like that next to the exhibition business, let's say? That would be my question.
And Isabel, that space of affection?
Yeah, a lot to say about that. One question that comes up for me, listening to all of us here, is what does activism look like, and what are the ranges of possibility there? And I definitely have never quite considered my work to be activist. At the same time, in this project, I really do feel like it's a micro politics, it's a micro activism of sensibility, like working on the sensibilities, and the particular sensibility of Western European culture, which is really stuck in its ideas of the separation of mind and body, of its very modernist notions of kind of categorization, all of the limitations of language, of intellect, of rationality, of fear of the body, of fear of affection, especially in the public arena. So in some ways, I think that I have to refer to Donna Haraway and her, when she brings up this idea of, how do we generate the capacity to be able to respond to like the critical issues of our time, the ecological crisis, political crisis, economic crises, that are of course all intertwined. To me, to cultivate that capacity to respond means a look towards the body, to bodily engagement, to attuning the senses, and actually taking the time to open up the senses in order to be able to create meaningful relations, not only interhuman, but between species and between humans and things. So I think affection in public space is absolutely what I'm working on out there on the Messeplatz every day these days, and since weeks here in Basel, is small, subtle ways of engaging the sensibility and trying to cultivate exactly that, a more attuned, a more sensitive, more awakened sense of bodily engagement.
So time has arrived for you in the audience. Ask some questions. And I think there is a mic in the room. There are a couple of questions in the middle of the room and one at the back.
Thanks. I find it really interesting that this conversation is under the header of public space, and it just occurred to me when you talked about the riot police coming, because if I remember correctly, the problem at the time was that there were these favelas that were an art project commissioned by Art Basel, and then the students came and brought their own favelas and a donkey and music and so on. And the reason why the police came was because Art Basel itself called the police. They said, there are some artists or some what do you call them, Ruhestörung, they're disturbing our peace. And what we as citizens of Basel didn't understand was that, well, this is common ground, this is public space, this is Allmend, yeah? It doesn't belong to Art Basel, and this was the argument. Art Basel said, we hired this space. This is not public space, this is private space during the run of the fair. So actually in the logic of Art Basel, your project would at the moment run in private space because Art Basel hired the Messeplatz.
Sure, but that's a technicality. That's a bureaucratic construction, right? Because, of course, when I'm on the microphone and my voice reaches over the entire space from one end to the other, all the way through the end of the tram station, there's no avoiding our porousness, our permeability to sound, those of us with hearing capabilities, right? So when the work is in session, it's absolutely public. It doesn't address only the fairgoers. It addresses anyone with hearing, actually.
And it has been addressing that public for previously 2 weeks at least, 2 or 3 weeks.
3 weeks, yeah, absolutely. Short, nonetheless. Oh no, I don't take it as a criticism. I'm only highlighting that it's that's a bureaucratic technicality. I don't know if that's what we experience on the platform.
I think one is one of the conversations that we have had, and of course we cannot speak for the organization and for that particular event, and of course you had time, I believe, to discuss this in different settings. But when we were having the conversation, one thing that struck me about talking about this space, I took the tram the first time that I visited the city, I took the bus, I came with number 2, I get out of the tram, and I walk into Basel, the Messeplatz, because I wanted to feel the square, right? I wanted to understand what it was. And to me, there was a sense of non-place that I think you mentioned earlier, in Morage's term, in which there was no elements of the squares that were presented to address any particular community, not even the people living here. And in fact, when you fly and land into Basel, you can see the main buildings that are almost seashore in the landscape. One of the things as a curator that I wanted to do, and for that I very much asked the help of the artists, I very much started in conversation with the artists, was to see how one can somehow transform the materiality of those buildings into something softer that could be permeable to our purposes, something softer that can take us out of Messeplatz, or even better, that can bring everything that is outside there here. But also, not only that, like trams pass by, people come in and out. You were, as you were saying, Enrique, when you were young, coming into Messeplatz, crossing the square twice a day. That kind of exercise for us was very important as an aspect to reflect upon. No? So in a way, there is something about the transforming such private space, or at least temporary private, into something that could be publicly claimed. Right? And that was our offer to the communities that we have been in touch with. We have students of mental health practices coming here. We have an orchestra, super art, with kids. We have the cliques that are both in a time where they get ownership of the city, but also as at that period, we had the beautiful composition of colleague Haglander that actually, I don't know if you have managed to hear, and I think you're not able to hear it anymore because the last one was yesterday, play with the emptiness of the square, using the echo as a way of connecting the drummer's beat, right? So all of those things were important, right? And bringing the community of Basel to the moment in which the community somehow is left out of the plaza was also important for us through this experience.
Hi. Because you talked about how the role of art in public spaces. I was just wondering, how effective is art at addressing social problems like discrimination, or, I don't know, like problems with social integration? Like, how does it really address, and how effective it is? And in what form is it most effective?
I just woke up. That's
a great question. Yeah.
Panel. It's a great question. It's case by case. I'll let you take over, Elvira.
Well, I mean, as a curator, I have to say, to me, art has always been a soft power. Art is not as strong as people changing legislation. What artists can do is to add complexity to the way we see ourselves, communities, history, our laws, and present opportunities to create awareness around those issues, right? There is a way in which we can tell stories and create or write histories, and our historian and professional are ready to do so. But to me, artists have the capacity not to tell the history the way it happens, but the way it feels. Right? The very same way artists can interview, or the way it felt in that sense. And in that very way, I think artists had the chance to create awareness of who we are as individuals, as a community, where we are, but they do it as citizens as much as we do it. So to respond to your question, I think art is, in that respect, is a soft power, but it creates a sense of a complex can create complexity and distort the way and the frame of the legislation and the framework that we are living.
And art is only as good as your audience, because it's a conversation. So you could make the most complex political work, but if the audience aren't open to that or interested in those ideas, then you're talking to nobody. They don't care. I mean, it's case by case. But I think like an artwork is always activated by the audience. And without an audience that's willing to be activated, then it's dumb, unfortunately.
Yep. I agree. It's case by case, but it's also depending on your goals, on the aim you are looking for. So, but that's the interesting thing. I repeat myself a little bit. On public space, you never know how it's going to get up, because it's not you alone as artist. Of course, you can provoke things, but that may work or not work, and that's a very difficult question, and that makes it more interesting. But I think it's absolutely possible to provoke. I am the type of, say, artist who likes to put the finger there where I think you have to put it on, and there are other artists who look more for being well together, to have a harmony inside the project. It's not my case, but I think that's, even if you try this or this, it can end totally different, with depending on who's assisting.
And I guess to respond to that, I guess I'm less focused on art as a category per se, as a modernist category, more interested in bodily praxis and the kinds of bodily practices which might generate a different kind of sensibility in a society, which might then be able to make a different kind of response, whether it be political, economic, ecological, or otherwise.
I think we had time for one last question before we go, because as life happened, Isabel has to go back to activate this word, but maybe we can hear this last question.
Thank you so much for the conversation. I want to ask another question about politics of space again, because it seems to me that there's a kind of binary division between the spatial practice of cultural figures, managers, artists, creatives, who develop sort of representational space to tell stories, let's say, and the spatial practice of institutions in cities like Basel, the art fair, pharmaceuticals, large architecture bureaus, the city itself, who kind of, limit space, structure it, give access or not, and so on. And this is kind of binary division between the two across representations of space, representational space. And I wonder if art practices or cultural practices in general shouldn't try and actually deconstruct that rather neat ordering that, the institutions seem to have power over the order, the strategy, these sort of Feverian, Sartorian areas of like stratified space. And to sort of deconstruct it, not to say that, doing these imaginative, creative public interventions are not essential, but to undo the actual political structuring of space is something that seems a little bit, not amiss, but is a challenge.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you were yesterday in, sorry guys that I still the party. No, I mean, unfortunately, I won't be able to expand on my response because we had to go. But I wanted just to point out of one of the contributors to Basilea, Recetas Urbanas, which is basically an architectural collective that have been for 20 years working around using architecture as a social inquiry, using architecture to question not only public space, our participation, but also to change legislation and to work with the legal loopholes, right? And to try to also, in a way, I think in a way that is perhaps it has a larger or more lasting imprint when we are talking about institutional framework or infrastructural frameworks, right? Because they not only produce these ephemeral structure, but also actual architecture that remains in the space. And sometimes, and I wanted to point to the conversation we had yesterday around issues of self-governance and self-construction, right? In which some of the things that you're asking were actually challenged, but no, because they presented for an hour about projects that they have been doing for 20 years. They talk about architecture collective and networks and associationism that is actually changing laws in Spain, that are changing brief for architectural competition, but also for artistic competition, that are creating awareness of the problems with mental health and the way that working with people that have certain sort of, let's say, like marginalized from normalcy, right? Like are facing in order to engage with certain practices, and all of that has to do with what you're saying, with blurring this boundary between one institutional realm and the other, right? And I think it's important, and I'm happy to, introduce you to the project and to those aspects of the project, because I think Recetas Urbanas, but also Straddle, but the project that Patty and Aharo is doing in Cape Verde are trying to challenge that in a large way. They are affecting laws, they're affecting legislation, and I think that is very important, both in the realm of art, but also in the realm of politics. So we have to go. I have to say goodbye. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. And I invite you to continue the conversation. We have Isabel Luis tomorrow in Mesa Plus as part of the Art Basel conversation with Andrea Lisioni, Claire Tancons, and Catherine Wood, talking about techno, and tech, talking about your practice and expanding from some of the issues and concerns that we have, not only exploring this panel, but also in the project. So I'll see you then soon. Thank you.